Okay, everybody, let's talk a little bit about cameras inside of Maya. So by default, we don't have any cameras set up. We're just in the perspective viewport. So we need to add a camera. So there's a couple different ways we can do that. Under Create, right underneath Lights, you'll see Cameras. I very rarely use this method, but this is one way to create a camera. So I can just click Camera, and it instantly creates a camera as an object. You can see I can move this camera object around. And this is my new camera. If I want to look through this camera, I can do View, and I can do cycle through cameras, and it'll look through the camera that's available. Or I can go to Panels, Perspective, and then Camera 1. That's the one that I just created. And now I'm in this camera view, okay? And I can just use my regular default viewport navigation tools to navigate within this camera. I don't use that method very often, so I'm going to delete that camera. The one that I use the most is I just kind of use my perspective. And then once I have this perspective set up the way I want, so let's add a couple objects in here. So we'll just make a quick scene. Really nice scene here. Look how nice this is. Just to give it a little bit of depth. Whoops. Okay, let's move this back a little. Maybe even make this small. Okay, so I have my really nice scene here. Really cool. Let's move that back down. Sorry, I'm being picky. But usually what I'll do is, let's move the cube over. I'm going to change this up a little bit. Kind of going, I want to show a little bit of depth here. There we go. There we go. Okay, so now I have my scene. If I want to show, or sorry, if I want to create this perspective as my camera, I'm just going to do View, Create Camera from View, or Control-Shift-C. So now a camera has been created. Now the tricky part about this is it just calls it Perspective 1 instead of Camera 1. But if you go to Panels, Perspective, Perspective 1 is my new camera. I can rename that. So Cam 1, okay? Or I can do that under View as well. I can do Cycle Through Camera View. So you can see, whoops, I did create Cycle Through Camera. So it's going to cycle through. Right now there's only one. But the default is the perspective. So this is the perspective. And you can see my actual physical camera exists in 3D space. You will see another little menu here that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to turn that off for now. Okay. But let's take a peek at some of the camera settings. So to get back to that camera, let's do Cycle Through Cameras. Or I can do Panel, Perspective, Cam 1. So this is my camera. So the first thing I'm going to do as I work with this camera is I'm going to lock the camera. Because I don't want to move. Now, if I do any of my keyboard shortcuts to navigate the viewport, I can't move this around. The next thing I'm going to do is go to camera attributes. Okay? Maybe. There we go. I don't know why that didn't come up the first time. But now I'm in my camera. I have my camera attributes active. So you can see camera 1 here. Even if I select it over here, I have camera 1 and then camera shape 1. So this is what I'm looking at. So I have a couple options here, and this actually went down a little bit. The default focal length is 35, and this is going to be in millimeters. So even if we change under Windows, Settings and Preferences, even if we change the settings to something else, like meters or even centimeters, cameras are just in millimeters. That's just how that works. So every camera lens is going to be the number and then millimeters. So this is a 35 millimeter lens by default. If you have questions about lenses though, let me know. I can always help with that. But I just Googled some information here, a nice little chart. This is just on Nikon's website. But it gives you a little bit on the different types of lenses and what they do. And it also gives you a little bit on aperture, or the f-stop as they'll call it in here. So in Maya. So this is an 18 millimeter lens. You can see that's really wide. So this is the same little wedding scene here. And as we kind of, I think does it click? You can drag it. Yeah, as you drag, so 18 millimeter, that's a pretty wide angle lens. Okay, you're getting a lot of the scene. So right here, the photographer's not moving. So the photographer in this example is not moving. They're just changing lenses. Okay, so they're not getting closer or further away from the subject. They're staying still. So this is an 18 millimeter lens. 35 millimeter lens, and it's pretty much supposed to be the same shot, right? So you're getting less of the house and less of the people on the outside, and you're starting to, hone in on the subjects in the middle here. And then you got a 70 millimeter lens, and now you can see before, like this one, you didn't even really know there was a couple getting married there. And as the 35, you start to see the couple, tells more of the story. And as you get closer, this is a 70 millimeter lens. So this is a larger lens, millimeter. So it looks like it's focusing in on actually a smaller area. A 130, that's like getting really, really in there. Really, really tight on the subjects here. And then a 300 millimeter. This is almost like an outdoor, like a birding lens, really. You really wouldn't need this for a wedding. The highest that you would usually use on a wedding would be like a 200 millimeter lens. So in between the 130 and the 300. Okay, but you can see the variation. So in this example, the photographer did not move. So the photographer in this instance is the camera. So the camera did not move, right? It's just a different lens. So basically, as you change the lenses, different lenses tell different stories. Okay, so this one says party. This one says, you still probably see the couple getting married, but this one says wedding, and this one says, there's still kind of a party, but it includes some of the other guests, and then the last two are basically just the couple getting married. All right, and then on the left here, you'll also see this aperture value, or this f-stop value. So at 3.2. Basically, the focal distance on this, the focal length is smaller, so not everything is going to be in focus. Okay, and as we go up to higher value numbers here, more objects will come into focus. So like f22, if you shoot something at f22, basically everything's going to be in focus. Okay, as you drop down to some of these other values, the focal plane gets smaller. So less objects are in focus. And you can actually keep going with this. You can go all the way to, I don't think Nikon makes a lens that goes this slow. Oh, they probably do, but Canon does. It's a 1.2 lens. Most of the lenses are going to be 1.4 to 1.8. And those are pretty good lenses. And basically what this value is, it's how much light is getting inside of the camera. Okay, so the small, and this part gets a little bit confusing. So the smaller the number, the larger the opening. Okay, so the aperture is a physical piece of equipment, so it actually opens and closes. It's kind of like these little rounded blades that they open and close to let in more or less light. So the smaller value, like a 1.8 or for example 3.2, is going to let in more light, and then the f22 is going to be very tiny opening. It's not going to let much light in. So you can actually see that start to get a little bit darker if they didn't change any other settings. Okay, so that's just a little bit of camera knowledge. Okay, and I'm a photographer as well, so I know lots of camera knowledge if you have questions about it. But anyway, so this default lens, unlocked, so I can't move my my camera. So this default focal length, that's the lens type. Okay, you really want to use this slider to just have some random lens type. You want to keep it off of pretty much a real world lens type. So you saw that 18 millimeter, that's going to be very, very wide, almost like fisheye. So remember, as I change these focal lengths, the camera is staying in position. Then you might have a 24 millimeter lens, that's still pretty wide. 35 is probably the most common lens used because it's kind of a little bit of both. It's still very storytelling, but it's not super wide angle. And then a 50 millimeter lens, you're going to start to hone in. And then 85 millimeter lens, we're really looking at one specific object. And then usually it would just be a 200 millimeter lens. We're like right in on one little tiny thing. So it kind of gets rid of the rest of that background there. So all right, let's stick with that 35. The rest of these we're not going to really adjust. We don't need to mess with those. You'll also notice this is changing the angle of view. So the only thing I want to change on this is the focal length. And I want to keep it based off a real world lens most of the time, which would be, that 35, the 50, 85, 200 millimeter. There is a 135, but that's not used that often. Even 300 millimeter lens as well. And then you can go, more wide angle too. You can do like a 14 or a 24. Okay, so that's it for the lenses. We're not going to mess with any of the other items here, but we do want to jump into depth of field. So if I activate depth of field, everything gets kind of blurry. And this is that f number, or that aperture number that we were talking about previously. So this is at f5.6. I don't think this is going to affect the light in the scene. I think this is just related to depth of field. So it's not exactly like a real camera. So in a real camera, you have like a focus button. So you focus in on an object. In here, we have to actually determine where the object is and set the focal distance manually. So it's not like we can just like touch the screen and say, focus in on this cube. That would be a very nice plugin though. If they made like a camera in application that actually worked like a real camera, that would make a lot of sense. I don't know that anybody makes that yet. But anyway, we need to see where this object is. So we want this cube to be in focus. So we need to figure out how far the cube is from the camera, okay? So let's do that. So under display, heads up display, and object details, and it's right there. Distance from the camera, so 426. Okay, so 426. So I go back on my camera. The focal distance, that's what we want. We want that to be 426. So now 426 is in there, and you can see the cube, and my camera angle is not the best. Let me change my camera angle a little bit. I don't have any lights in here either, but there we go. Now this actually changed. Now look at the distance. Now it's 440. I'm going to relock this. It's basically the same though. Not too much. It's going to change. 440. So now the cube is in focus. And essentially these objects here are starting to blur out a little bit. So basically this f-stop value, again, we want to base that off of real world values pretty much. So those would range anywhere from 1.2. Okay, that's going to be a very, very large opening. So to get, for example, if I was going to take a photo of somebody's face and I was at 1.2 and I focused on one eye, at 1.2 the other eye might not even be in focus all the way because that's such a large opening and so much light is getting in. I don't know that that's always the best bet for this. Okay, so for our purposes, some safe bets are like 2.8. That's a safe bet. Okay, so that's a larger focal distance. That f22 is, I mean, that still work, but mostly everything is going to be in focus. But some ranges, 2.2. Whoops. Okay, you can see that just kind of that cube is in focus. I think the default was at 5.6, and then you can Google some other ones. I mean, I'm usually when I'm shooting even 3.4. Oops. Those are some other ranges. You don't want to just drag the slider and have some random values, really. I mean, you can kind of see that. So there is not really a one, but you can see those values change as that value increases. But actually what's happening is the aperture is getting smaller, less light is getting in. So that's just a little bit of camera knowledge. But let's just try that 2.8. I think that's fine. So 2.8. So, and then I can actually still go back in and move the camera. And you can see, even if I zoom in or out, it's not going to change the focal distance live on here. So I need to say, okay, what if I want this object back here? So that object is 341. Camera, let's try that 341. So now it's starting to look back there. Okay, you can see that one start to come into play. And maybe that one needs to be that 3.8. And then we can even manipulate that and try some other values in there. So what was that, 341? Let's see what happens if we do 400. That's going past it, so that focal plane. So it's a plane, so it's a focal plane, and we're trying to put the object in the middle of that focal plane. So 340, pretty darn close. This one is 113. Let's try that. And then actually I'm gonna zoom out a little bit so we can see 167. I think that was 167. Yeah, there we go. You can see the edges start to come into focus a little bit more, but maybe we need to up this value. Maybe it's 7. So not too bad. And then you can see you can adjust that as well. And it's not exactly like a real camera, because I don't know that it's just a little bit, it's based off a real camera. Look at that change. That's wild. Look at the shape of that change as I kind of manipulate that value. Okay. But we want to try and keep it based off a real value, or strange things can happen. So like that f22, that's usually maximum. Like there's not like 64. We don't have that value. Most cameras just do f22. So you basically have 1.2 to f22. Those kind of values to work with. Okay. Okay. It's kind of fun. Yeah. So that's basically it. So for your camera basics. If you want to delete a camera, remember we can actually delete it out of the outliner, or you can delete it live on stage. So that's kind of fun stuff with the camera. And to get to this, it was under display, heads up display, object details. All right, hopefully you had fun.